December 18th, 1944. The wind tore through the Bavarian hills like a living thing screaming against the barbed wire fences that marked the edges of a hastily built camp. Snow fell sideways thick and merciless, burying the world in white silence, broken only by the rattle of tin roofs and the distant cry of someone trying to hold on. Inside one of the wooden sheds, women huddled together in thin dresses that had lost their color long ago, fabric stiff with frost and fear. Their breath rose in clouds, fragile ghosts of warmth that vanished too quickly in the bitter cold. Somewhere in the corner, a child whimpered a small, cracked sound that pierced the frozen air deeper than any shell ever could. The guards walked their rounds with shoulders bent against the wind, faces half hidden under scarves, trying not to look too long at the people behind the wire. No one had expected it to be this cold. No one had expected the war to feel this endless. Sergeant Michael O'Connor's hands were numb inside his gloves, his heart heavier than the rifle slung over his shoulder. He had seen battlefields turn red and cities turn to dust, but nothing felt as unbearable as the quiet suffering here. Private Williams, just 19, stared at the dim lights of the barracks and thought of home of his sister sleeping under warm quilts somewhere far from this frozen world. The night stretched on without mercy, and the line between enemy and human began to blur in the snow. Each gust of wind carried the same thought through the camp, unspoken yet shared by all. If the cold didn't end soon, neither would they. The storm did not stop when morning came. It only changed its rhythm, slower, heavier, more deliberate, as if the sky itself was too tired to keep fighting. The wind howled through the cracks of the barracks, finding every weak seam, slipping its icy fingers into the bones of those inside. Snow had piled so high against the outer walls that the view from the small grimy windows was nothing but white, a colorless world that made time seem meaningless. Inside, the German women were awake, though none had really slept. The cold had crept into their dreams and settled there, a quiet terror that never left. Ingrid Mueller sat upright against the wooden wall, holding 6-year-old Klaus against her chest, feeling the boy's shallow breaths on her collarbone. His small hands were like stones, too cold to move. She rubbed them gently, whispering something soft in German, a lullaby she could barely remember. Her own lips were cracked and bleeding, but she kept humming, afraid that if she stopped, the silence would swallow them both. At the far corner, Maria Fisher coughed again, a deep rattling sound that shook her entire frame. She tried to hide it behind her hand, ashamed of the noise, but it was no use. The others turned to look worry etched on their faces, though none spoke. Talking had become an effort too costly. The women's voices were hoarse from breathing the cold air all night. They had no tears left, only a dull ache of endurance. Some stared at the ceiling, tracing the frozen patterns that had formed there from their own breath. It was strange how the frost looked almost beautiful, delicate, and shimmering, even as it signaled death. Outside, Sergeant O'Connor made his first patrol of the day. His boots sank deep into the snow, leaving dark impressions that the wind quickly erased. He hated walking past the sheds in the early hours. It made him feel like an intruder in someone else's nightmare. He could hear them moving inside, muffled sounds of shivering, the occasional soft sob. These were not the sounds of soldiers or prisoners. They were the sounds of human beings trying to survive something neither side had chosen. He pulled his coat tighter and looked at the sky, gray and endless. There was no sun, no direction, only duty. Private Williams followed a few paces behind. He carried the same haunted look that O'Connor had seen on many young faces that winter. Williams tried not to stare too long at the people inside the wire, but curiosity always won. He had grown up in Iowa, where winters were harsh but full of life, sled rides, laughter, his mother's stew simmering on the stove. Here the cold felt different. It wasn't just weather, it was punishment. The women reminded him of neighbors from back home, the kind that would bring pies to church socials or wave from porches. Now their faces were pale, hollowed, their eyes ringed with shadow. It was hard to believe these were the enemies he had been told to hate. Inside the camp, rations had been delayed again. Breakfast was nothing more than a thin slice of bread and a spoonful of something they called soup. though it was little more than hot water with a trace of cabbage. The women ate slowly, savoring the warmth, even when the taste turned bitter. Ingrid tore her bread in half and gave it to Klaus, pretending she wasn't hungry. The boy chewed silently, his eyes half closed, his body curled toward her for warmth. When he was done, he pressed his head against her shoulder, whispering "Danke," his voice barely audible. She smiled faintly, but her eyes drifted toward the door, where the draft was strongest. The wind moaned through it like a ghost. The guards knew the heaters, inside most barracks, were useless. The fuel had been rationed to the point of absurdity, enough to keep the guard station warm, but not enough for the prisoners. The logic was simple: they were not meant to be comfortable. Still, something about it gnawed at O'Connor's conscience. Every time he returned from patrol and felt the heat of the stove inside the guard hut, guilt prickled under his skin. He would remove his gloves and warm his hands, but the warmth didn't comfort him, it felt stolen. He caught Williams glancing toward the prisoners, more than once, his young face tense with something like confusion. "You think too much," O'Connor said one morning, trying to keep his tone light. Williams didn't answer right away. He looked toward the fence where Ingrid was helping an older woman sit up. "They look like they're freezing to death," he finally said. O'Connor sighed, his breath forming a cloud between them. "They probably are, but it's not our call. We follow orders." Williams nodded, but his jaw tightened. "Doesn't feel right, though. Not after what we've seen." Neither man said anything after that. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Both knew the rules. Both knew how easily compassion could be mistaken for weakness in a war that had already blurred too many lines. By midday, the storm grew worse again. Snow seeped under the doors, forming small drifts on the floor. The women tried to sweep it away with scraps of cloth, but it was useless. The wind howled louder, rattling the loose boards, making the walls groan like a ship caught in rough seas. A baby began to cry somewhere in the back, the high, thin wail rising above the storm. The sound broke whatever numbness had settled over them. Some women wept quietly. Others murmured prayers. Ingrid pressed her lips to Klaus's forehead, feeling his skin cold and damp. He wasn't shaking anymore. That frightened her more than the crying. As darkness crept in early, the sense of dread deepened. The guards moved through the camp like shadows, checking the perimeter, speaking in low voices. Williams could hear the wind scraping across the barbed wire, a sound like fingernails on steel. He thought of the women again, of the boy's hollow eyes. He wondered how long a person could last without real heat. He didn't know the answer, and he didn't want to find out. In the guard hut, the radio crackled faintly, reports from other sectors, warnings about supply lines, freezing roads blocked. O'Connor stared at the map on the wall, tracing the black lines of the front with his eyes. The war felt endless, an ocean of suffering stretching in every direction. He had believed in it once, believed that fighting evil made sense. But standing here miles from any real battle, guarding starving women and children in the cold, he wasn't sure what victory meant anymore. Later that night, when the generator failed again, the camp plunged into near total darkness. The only light came from a lantern flickering in the guard post, and the faint glow of candles the women had managed to save. The air felt thicker, heavier. Every breath hurt. O'Connor stood outside for a moment, watching the snow fall under the dim light, each flake catching a glint before disappearing into the dark. He could hear the faint crying again, the same small voice from before. It drifted across the yard, carried by the wind. Something inside him twisted. He wanted to shut it out, to remind himself that it wasn't his responsibility. But he couldn't. Inside the barracks, Ingrid rocked Klaus, gently whispering his name again and again, as if the sound could keep him alive. The boy's face was pale, his lips bluish. Maria sat nearby, watching silently. She had stopped coughing for a while, but her breathing was shallow, uneven. "He needs warmth," Maria said softly in German. "Real warmth." Ingrid nodded, tears freezing before they could fall. She looked toward the door, as if expecting a miracle. The hours passed slowly, each one colder than the last. Frost spread along the inside of the walls like veins of glass. The storm outside seemed to mock them, howling and laughing, throwing snow against the windows until it stuck in thick layers. The women took turns holding the children, sharing what little body heat they had. Their breath mingled in the air, forming a faint haze that caught the weak light of the lanterns. Somewhere, someone began to pray aloud. A low, trembling voice, speaking words that half the others didn't even understand. But they bowed their heads anyway. Faith was all they had left. And even that was fading. At the same time in the guard hut, William stared into the small fire that burned inside the iron stove. The warmth was almost painful now, too sharp against his chilled fingers. He imagined the women behind the wire, the children pressing against their mothers. He imagined the sound of that little boy's cry. He had never felt so far from home, so uncertain of what was right. He thought of his sister again, her laughter echoing in his mind, and wondered what she would think if she saw him here, standing in comfort, while others froze a few yards away. O'Connor watched him quietly. He recognized that look, the same one he had worn years ago when he first understood what war did to a man's heart. He didn't say anything. Words wouldn't help. They both knew what was coming. The storm would worsen before it eased. The heaters would stay broken. And before the next dawn, someone would die in that camp. The thought settled like a stone in his chest. He turned away from the window, trying not to hear the wind anymore, but it was useless. The sound filled everything, the air, the walls, the silence between breaths. It was no longer just cold outside. It was inside them now, in their blood, their thoughts, their faith. And as the night deepened over Bavaria, the fear that began in the prisoners' huts slowly made its way to the guards' hearts, binding everyone in the same fragile, frozen hope that somehow, against all odds, morning would still come. The night fell again, darker than the one before, and the storm began to move with a cruel rhythm that no one could ignore. The wind didn't whistle anymore. It screamed, hurling itself at the camp as if determined to tear the fragile shacks apart. Snow seeped in under every door, settling on the straw floors, melting slightly, then freezing again into thin, cruel sheets of ice. The barracks groaned under the weight of the wind, wood snapping in small bursts like brittle bones. Inside, no one spoke. The women were past words, now past even tears. Every sound came from the wind, or from the shallow breaths of those trying not to slip away into the cold. Ingrid held little Klaus tighter that evening, his face pressed against her chest, his body frighteningly still. She rubbed his arms and whispered to him, her voice trembling. His eyes fluttered open just long enough to look at her before closing again. His lips were a faint shade of blue and his skin felt like marble under her touch. "Please," she murmured more to herself than to anyone else, "just stay awake." The other women gathered around them in silence. Maria Fisher knelt nearby, a scarf wrapped over her head, coughing weakly between breaths. The cough had turned deep and raw, tearing at her lungs with every exhale. She wanted to help, but her hands shook so badly she could barely keep hold of the thin blanket they shared. Outside, Sergeant O'Connor stood by the fence line, his collar pulled up high, his breath rising in pale bursts. He had done his rounds 3 times already, though it made no difference. The storm had swallowed the camp in a white blur. Beyond a few feet, visibility vanished into nothing. The snow struck his face like shards of glass, yet he stayed outside longer than necessary. He told himself it was duty, but deep down he knew it was guilt that kept him there. He couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen that morning, women trying to scoop snow out of the huts with their bare hands, children shivering until their small bodies went limp. He had never seen that kind of fear before, not even in battle. Private Williams joined him, his youthful face pale under the dim light of a flickering lantern. "You can't even see the fence anymore," he said quietly. His voice trembled not from the cold, but from something heavier. O'Connor didn't answer. The 2 men stood there for a while, watching the storm devour everything around them. Then faintly through the howling wind came the sound, again, the cry of a child, muffled but unmistakable. Williams turned toward it instinctively, his eyes wide. "That's coming from Shed 7, he said. O'Connor didn't need to be told. He already knew. He could hear it too, a sound that cut straight through the noise of the storm. Inside the shed, panic had begun to grow. The small stove in the corner had long gone out, its last coal burned to ash. The air inside was colder than outside, now trapped and unmoving. Frost crept along the walls, crawling over the women's blankets like thin, ghostly vines. Ingrid could feel the cold rising from the floorboards, stealing the last of the warmth from Klaus's tiny body. She rocked him back and forth, whispering his name. "Klaus, listen to me. You must stay awake," she pleaded. But his breathing came slower, quieter. Around her, other women were moving sluggishly, their faces gray with exhaustion. Some had stopped shivering entirely. A dangerous sign Ingrid recognized from her years as a nurse. When the body stops fighting, it means it's surrendering. Maria forced herself up and crossed the narrow aisle to where Ingrid sat. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "He needs heat," she whispered, voice broken by coughs. Ingrid nodded, tears freezing on her lashes. "There's nothing left," she said. "Nothing." She looked toward the small window, where flakes of snow stuck to the glass, blurring the world beyond. If the night lasts much longer, she couldn't finish the thought. O'Connor and Williams pushed through the snow toward the same shed. The wind made it almost impossible to move. Every step felt like walking into a wall. Williams held the lantern high, the light flickering wildly. "We should check on them," he said, raising his voice over the wind. O'Connor hesitated. "We've got orders," he reminded him, but the words sounded hollow, almost meaningless against the sound of that crying. "Orders don't mean much if they're dead," Williams said, his tone sharp, desperate. O'Connor's jaw tightened. He looked at the boy beside him, the same kid who used to talk about baseball games and apple pie, and realized that war had already changed him too much. "Fine," he said at last, pulling his coat tighter. "But keep your head down. If anyone asks, we're checking for damage." They reached Shed 7 and paused outside the wind, slamming against the door so hard it rattled the hinges. The crying had turned softer, now weaker, like the voice of someone fading away. O'Connor pushed the door open, and the storm rushed in with him, scattering snow across the dirt floor. For a moment, the women inside froze in fear, expecting punishment. But instead, the sergeant simply stood there, staring at the scene before him. The shivering figures, the pale faces, the eyes too tired to plead. His throat tightened. He could barely recognize them as the same enemy he had been warned about. They looked like ghosts, already halfway gone. Williams followed him in his lantern, lighting up the small space. The boy saw the child first. Klaus curled up in Ingrid's arms, his face pressed against her neck. Something inside him broke. He knelt down, setting the lantern beside them, and reached for the blanket covering the child. It was damp and useless. "He's freezing," Williams said, voice cracking. Ingrid looked up at him, not understanding the words, but recognizing the worry in his eyes. She didn't stop him when he took off his gloves and pressed his bare hands against the boy's small fingers, trying to rub life back into them. The heat from his skin vanished, instantly swallowed by the cold. O'Connor watched in silence, the conflict raging inside him louder than the storm outside. Every rule, every line of protocol screamed at him to stop, to pull the private away, to close the door, to walk back into the snow and forget what he had seen. But he couldn't. Not tonight. Not after hearing that cry. He unbuttoned his heavy wool coat, the one issued for men fighting on the front lines, and dropped to his knees beside the nurse. Without a word, he draped the coat around her, and the boy wrapping them both in the thick fabric. For a second, no one moved. Then Ingrid gasped, feeling the sudden, shocking warmth. She looked up at the soldier, her eyes wide with disbelief. Why, she whispered in broken English. O'Connor didn't answer. He just nodded once and said quietly, "He'll be okay now." The other women stared, unsure if what they were seeing was real. Maria covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. O'Connor stood slowly, his body already trembling from the cold. He turned toward the door, intending to leave before the warmth faded from his resolve. But Williams was still kneeling beside the woman with the infant, his face set in determination. "She's not moving," he said. The baby's tiny chest barely rose and fell. Williams didn't think twice. He took off his own coat and wrapped it around both of them, tucking the edges in tight. "Don't let her sleep," he said softly, though he knew the woman couldn't understand him. "Keep her awake." The temperature inside the shed seemed to lift slightly, not enough to be warm, but enough to bring back a fragile hope. The women began to move again, huddling closer together, shifting the coats so the warmth spread. Someone started to hum a low trembling tune that sounded like a prayer. Ingrid pressed her face into the wool fabric that still carried the soldier's scent, gun oil, sweat, and something faintly like tobacco, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless. O'Connor and Williams stood in the snow, their uniforms soaked, their bodies shaking violently. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The light from the shed flickered behind them, and for a moment it looked almost like a candle burning in the dark, a fragile defiance against the cold. When they returned to the guard hut, the other men stared. Some muttered under their breath. One of them, Corporal Morrison, frowned. "What the hell happened out there? You look half dead." O'Connor didn't answer right away. He moved to the stove, holding his hands over the small flame. "Nothing," he said finally. "Just a long night." But Williams couldn't stay silent. "There's a kid in there," he said, his voice low. "He was dying." Morrison shook his head. "You know the rules." "You can't just," but O'Connor cut him off with a look that silenced the room. "Then maybe the rules are wrong," he said. No one replied. The wind screamed outside, battering the walls, but inside the silence grew heavier. The truth of what they'd done hung in the air between them. A quiet rebellion. A small flicker of humanity, in a place built to extinguish it. O'Connor sat down heavily, feeling the cold settle deep into his bones. He knew the price he might pay if the officers found out, but as he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face again, no longer blue, breathing steady against his mother's chest. For that, he would endure anything. The storm could rage all it wanted. Something far stronger had begun to stir inside that camp, something no winter could freeze again. By dawn, the storm had quieted, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the wind. The camp looked buried beneath a frozen ocean, snow piled high against the fences, and rooftops muting every sound. The world felt suspended, waiting for something that refused to come. The soldiers moved slowly that morning, their limbs stiff from the cold, their eyes dulled by exhaustion. O'Connor could barely feel his hands even inside his gloves. His coat was gone, and the thin uniform beneath offered little protection. He had barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw that boy's face again, pale and still. But when he'd returned to the shed before sunrise, he'd found Klaus breathing his tiny chest, rising and falling steadily. It was a fragile miracle, and the memory stayed with him like a quiet fire burning in the cold. Private Williams sat across from him in the guard hut, staring into the small stove where the last of their wood cracked and hissed. His face was colorless, his lips pale, but there was something new in his expression, something like purpose. He hadn't spoken much since the night before. When O'Connor asked if he was all right, he just nodded. But his hands, raw from cold, trembled as he tightened the straps of his boots. He didn't regret what he'd done. Not for a second. The memory of the woman clutching her baby, the flicker of life returning to the child's face, it was enough. Outside, the storm had left its mark. Drifts reached nearly to the windowsills. The paths between barracks were nothing but narrow trenches, dug by shovels and boots. Men moved in silence, breaking ice from the water barrels, hauling rations, checking the fences. The cold had changed everyone. No one barked orders anymore. Voices were low movements, deliberate, as if they all understood that one wrong gesture could break the thin balance that held them together. In Shed 7, Ingrid was awake, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders. O'Connor's heavy coat still covered her, and Klaus. She had folded part of it around the boy's legs, using it like a cocoon. His skin was warm now, his cheeks faintly flushed with life. Ingrid watched him sleep, and felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in months, a faint spark of hope. Around her, the other women whispered quietly, still in disbelief at what had happened. The American gave his coat, one of them said softly. He gave it away. The words spread from mouth to mouth, like a secret too powerful to keep. Maria, sitting by the wall, with a cup of melted snow warming in her hands, smiled weakly. "Maybe they're not all monsters," she whispered. Ingrid met her eyes and nodded. For the first time since capture, the word enemy didn't feel solid anymore. It felt fragile, almost meaningless. Later that morning, when O'Connor came by on patrol, every pair of eyes followed him through the gaps in the wooden walls. He didn't look inside, but he could feel their gazes like warmth against his back. The women had seen him as a soldier, once a figure to fear. Now they saw him as something else, something they couldn't quite name. He moved slower than usual, his breath coming out in soft puffs. The cold had bitten deep into him during the night. He knew he would pay for it later. His joints already ached, and a fever lingered behind his temples. But he didn't care. At midday, Corporal Morrison approached him, his face tense. "Command will find out, you know," he said under his breath. "They'll ask questions. You gave away government property." O'Connor didn't look up. He was repairing a fence, his gloved hands steady despite the tremor in them. "Let them ask," he said simply. Morrison hesitated, then sighed. "I checked the other sheds," he added quietly. "There are kids in worse shape than that one. I don't know how long they'll last." The words hung in the air like a challenge neither man wanted to face. That night, the cold returned sharper, more merciless than before. The wind had shifted, driving the temperature even lower. The guards lit every lantern they had, their pale light glowing faintly against the snow. Williams couldn't shake the sound of the coughing he'd heard from Shed 12 earlier that day. He thought of the woman with the toddler, the one who had barely survived the night before. He wondered if she was still alive. When he finally went to check, he found Morrison already there. The corporal stood by the open door, his own coat draped around a cluster of shivering children. He turned when Williams approached, his face pale but calm. "You're not the only fool in this camp," he said softly. Williams just stared at him. The corporal looked away, adding, "I figured if you two could do it, maybe the rest of us can too." Inside the shed, the women looked up in astonishment. Morrison's presence had been one of strict discipline before. He was the one who shouted the loudest when someone broke formation. Now he moved with quiet hands, tucking the coat around the smallest child. "It's only for tonight," he said awkwardly in broken German. "Just tonight." The women nodded, tears glistening in their eyes. Gratitude didn't need translation. By midnight, 3 more guards had followed. Some brought extra blankets from the supply tent. Others brought rations, slipping them under the doors when no one was looking. The camp once divided by wire, and orders began to blur at the edges. What had started as one act of defiance turned into something larger, something none of them could stop, even if they wanted to. O'Connor felt it too. When he checked the outer perimeter, he saw shadows moving from hut to hut, soldiers carrying bundles, women standing by the doors to receive them. It wasn't rebellion. It was survival, shared, silent, fragile. He felt a strange ache in his chest, something between pride and fear. He knew that if command ever discovered this, they'd all be court-martialed. But watching those small acts of mercy unfold in the freezing dark, he couldn't bring himself to stop it. Inside Shed 7, Ingrid could hear footsteps outside, softer than before. The night didn't sound like fear anymore. It sounded like movement, like breath, like life. She looked down at Klaus, who had woken up and was blinking at her sleepily. "It's all right," she whispered. "It's going to be all right." Her voice trembled, but the words felt real this time. Maria was awake too, coughing less now. She had started teaching some of the women how to rub their hands and feet in circles to keep the blood moving. "We keep moving, we stay alive," she said in a rasping voice. The others listened, their hands clumsy but determined. By the early hours of morning, the entire camp seemed different. The wind still blew, the snow still fell, but the hopelessness that had filled the air was thinning. Soldiers on night duty shared cigarettes with each other in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Some talked quietly about home, about the faces waiting for them somewhere across the ocean. And in the sheds, the German women began to whisper prayers, not for victory or revenge, but for those on the other side of the fence. O'Connor sat alone outside the guard hut, watching the horizon slowly lighten with the first faint hint of dawn. His body ached, his lungs burned, but his heart was steady. He thought about how strange it was the way war stripped men down until all that was left was the choice between cruelty and compassion. He wasn't sure which side he belonged to anymore. Maybe that was the point. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, its light was weak and pale, but it was enough to glint off the snow like silver. O'Connor stood brushing frost from his sleeves. Across the camp he saw movement, German women stepping out of their huts, blinking against the light, holding children close. For a moment, No one moved. Then one of the women, Greta, lifted her hand in a small, hesitant wave toward the guards. William, standing nearby, hesitated before lifting his own gloved hand in return. It wasn't much a gesture, a breath, but it carried something sacred. That morning, the camp was no longer a prison in the way it had been. The walls still stood, the orders still existed, but the hatred had cracked. It was as if the storm had stripped everything down to what mattered most. In the frozen silence, hearts had thawed just enough to remember what it meant to be human. O'Connor looked toward the sky, his breath forming a thin white trail. "It's not over," he murmured, knowing the war would still rage on, knowing there would still be orders and battles and losses. But something inside him had shifted forever. Behind him, the camp began to stir with cautious life. Somewhere, a child laughed, a small trembling sound, fragile against the cold, but it was laughter all the same. And for the first time in that endless winter, the morning didn't feel so empty. By the third day after the storm, the camp no longer looked the same. The snow had stopped falling, but its weight still pressed on everything as if the world had forgotten how to breathe. The fences glittered under the pale sun, icicles hanging like knives from the wire. Inside the barracks, silence gave way to the slow rhythm of recovery. Weak coughs, hushed voices, the shuffle of boots on frozen ground. The crisis had passed, but something deeper lingered, something no one could quite name. The soldiers moved differently now. Their steps were slower, their eyes softer, as if they were afraid to disturb what fragile peace had settled over the place. Sergeant O'Connor stood by the edge of the camp, staring toward the mountains in the distance. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind that promised another wave of cold before spring. His body still ached from the night he had given away his coat, and his hands were cracked and raw. But the pain no longer felt like punishment. It was something he had chosen. He found a strange comfort in that thought. Behind him, Private Williams was stacking firewood near the sheds, his breath rising in steady clouds. Every so often he'd glance toward Shed 7, where the German women had started hanging their blankets in the weak sunlight, trying to dry them. The sight of it made him smile, small, tired, but real. Ingrid Mueller had not forgotten what the soldiers had done. She had spent the past 2 days tending to the children, using her limited medical supplies to treat frostbite and exhaustion. O'Connor's heavy coat still hung near the door of the shed, now dry, folded neatly. She couldn't bring herself to give it back yet. Each time she touched the fabric, she felt a warmth that wasn't just physical. Klaus followed her everywhere, his cheeks pink again, his small hands gripping the edge of her skirt. The boy had begun to laugh quietly at times, a sound that startled everyone around him. It was as if his laughter reminded them of something they'd all forgotten, that joy could still exist here, even if only for a moment. Maria Fisher had taken on a new role, too. Despite her lingering cough, she started organizing the women to clean the shed, repair broken planks, and share the scarce rations more evenly. Her voice, though weak, carried authority. "We survived the storm," she told them. "Now we must help each other stay alive." There was no bitterness in her words, only quiet determination. The others listened. They had all seen how the American soldiers had stepped beyond orders that night, and it gave them permission to believe again, in kindness, in purpose, in something more than endurance. By the second evening, O'Connor noticed a strange thing. When he walked his rounds, the women no longer avoided his gaze. Some nodded to him, a few even managed faint smiles. One woman, an older nurse named Greta, approached the fence to hand back a tin cup he hadn't realized was missing. "Danke," she said softly. The word lingered in the cold air, trembling but sincere. O'Connor nodded, not trusting his own voice. Later that night in the guard hut, the men sat in silence around the stove. The usual grumbling and jokes were gone. Instead, there was a heaviness that came from knowing they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Morrison broke the quiet first. "The colonel will be here tomorrow," he said, his voice low. "Inspection." Williams looked up sharply. "You think he'll find out?" Morrison shrugged. "Word spreads fast. Someone's bound to talk." No one said anything after that. The fire crackled, filling the space between their thoughts. O'Connor knew the risk, but he also knew the alternative. Doing nothing, letting those people freeze, would have destroyed something inside him that no punishment could repair. When Lieutenant Colonel Patterson arrived the next morning, the air in the camp changed. The guards stood straighter eyes, forward, their uniforms stiff with cold. Patterson walked through the compound with slow, deliberate steps, his coat buttoned high, his hat casting a shadow across his face. He was known as a strict officer, the kind who measured men by their obedience. O'Connor followed a few paces behind, heart pounding. They stopped near Shed 7. The colonel frowned when he noticed movement inside. "Prisoners are awake early," he muttered. O'Connor didn't reply. Patterson opened the door. Inside, the women froze, mid-motion. Ingrid stood near the center, holding Klaus in her arms. The sunlight from the open door painted everything in shades of gold and white. The rough wooden walls, the faces lined with fatigue, the child's small, curious eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Patterson saw the coat draped over a chair, the unmistakable American issue wool and olive green. His gaze turned to O'Connor. "Explain," he said. O'Connor straightened. "They were freezing, sir," he said quietly. "There was a child. He wouldn't have made it." Patterson's eyes narrowed. "That's not your concern, Sergeant. You were given clear orders." The silence that followed was long enough for everyone in the shed to feel it press against their skin. Then, unexpectedly, Patterson exhaled. "And yet," he said, his voice softer, "now, no one died that night." He looked around, his expression unreadable. "I've seen worse camps, in better weather. Whatever you did here, it worked. Don't let it happen again." He turned to leave, and for a heartbeat O'Connor wasn't sure if he had been condemned or forgiven. But when the colonel stepped outside, his pace had slowed. He didn't ask for the coat back. In the days that followed, something new began to take shape. The line between guard and prisoner continued to blur, not through defiance, but through necessity. Morrison, who had once barked orders, began teaching the older women how to mend torn boots using wire and scraps of leather. Williams helped fix a broken water pipe with 2 German mechanics who had been captured months earlier. They worked side by side in silence until one of the women handed him a small piece of bread in thanks. He accepted it without hesitation. At night, when the cold pressed hard again, the guards would quietly leave bundles of firewood near the sheds. In return, the women began helping keep the camp cleaner, more organized. Ingrid and Maria took charge of a small infirmary corner, treating both prisoners and guards for frostbite and illness. The cooperation was unspoken but real, a fragile bridge built out of shared struggle. O'Connor often found himself watching from a distance. Each act of kindness, however small, carried weight. He thought about how strange it was that compassion, something so simple, could survive in a place built on fear. But he also felt a growing unease. The war was still raging beyond these fences. If anyone outside learned what was happening here, the punishment would fall hard on everyone. Still, he couldn't bring himself to stop it. Once mercy had started to flow, it refused to be contained. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Ingrid approached the fence. She held the coat in her hands, folded neatly. O'Connor met her eyes through the wire. "It belongs to you now," he said, his breath misting in the air. She shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "It belongs to all of us." Then, to his surprise, she reached through the gap in the fence and pressed something into his palm. A small wooden cross, carved roughly, the kind that could fit in a pocket. "For the warmth," she whispered. O'Connor closed his fingers around it, unable to speak. That night, when the camp lights flickered and the wind rose again, he held the cross in his hand and listened to the faint hum of women singing in one of the sheds. The melody was soft, carried by voices too tired to rise, but too stubborn to fall silent. It wasn't a hymn he recognized, but its rhythm sank into him heavy and tender. He thought of the boys' laughter that morning, of Maria's quiet strength, of Patterson's half-forgiven silence. For the first time since the war began, O'Connor prayed not for victory, not for safety, but for something simpler. He prayed that when spring came, when the snow finally melted and the fences came down, the memory of what had happened here would remain, that men would remember this fragile kindness when the world tried to forget it again. And as he sat there in the dark, the wooden cross warm against his skin, he realized that perhaps the greatest battles were not fought with rifles or orders, but with moments like these, moments where fear and compassion met in the same frozen, Breath and humanity chose against every rule to survive. Spring did not come all at once. It crept into the Bavarian hills, hesitantly melting the snow a little each day, uncovering mud and broken branches where ice had ruled for months. The air softened, but the cold never vanished completely. It stayed in the bones, in the memory. By the time the first green touched the fields outside the wire, the war was already nearing its end. Planes passed overhead, less often now. Distant artillery had fallen silent. Yet inside the camp no one spoke of peace. They didn't know what it would mean when it finally arrived. Sergeant O'Connor stood by the fence one morning watching the women hang sheets and blankets under the pale sunlight. Klaus ran in small circles around Ingrid's legs, his laughter sharp and pure against the quiet. The sound still startled O'Connor every time he heard it, as if joy were something too fragile for a place like this. Williams was stacking crates nearby, glancing toward them occasionally, the ghost of a smile touching his face. Life, he thought, had a way of returning even where death had been expected. But beneath that fragile normalcy lay unease. They all knew the war was changing shape, and with it the world they had built in this frozen corner of Germany would soon be swept away. Ingrid felt it too. Every sunrise brought a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because another night had passed without loss. Dread because each day drew her closer to the unknown. She had stopped counting the days since her capture. Time had lost its structure, reduced to survival. Now she found herself wondering what would happen when the gates opened. Would they be sent home? Would there even be a home left to return to? The thought of leaving the camp, a place that had once terrified her, now filled her with unexpected sadness. It had become, in its strange way, a shelter. The cooperation between the prisoners and the guards had grown almost natural. The women tended to the gardens the soldiers had helped clear of snow, planting whatever seeds could be found. They repaired torn uniforms, cooked meals when rations allowed, and nursed the sick without hesitation. In return, the soldiers shared supplies quietly, ignoring the strict regulations that forbade such exchanges. No one called it kindness anymore. It was simply how things were done. O'Connor watched this quiet transformation unfold with both pride and anxiety. He knew it couldn't last. The army would reclaim order soon enough, and compassion rarely survived the return of order. One evening a jeep arrived at the camp carrying official papers. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson gathered the men in the yard. His expression was unreadable as he unfolded the message. "Berlin has fallen," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Some soldiers cheered softly. Others just stared at the ground. O'Connor felt nothing at first. No triumph, no release, just a hollow awareness that something enormous had ended. Across the fence, the women sensed the shift too. Ingrid met Maria's eyes, and neither spoke. They understood without words the war was ending, but endings were never clean. That night, the camp was quiet in a different way. There was no wind, no storm, no fear pressing down on them, only the strange stillness of waiting. William sat outside the guard hut, his rifle across his knees, staring up at a sky full of stars. "You think they'll send us home now?" he asked. O'Connor didn't answer right away. "Home's a long way off," he said finally, "and maybe we don't go back the same." Williams nodded slowly. "I don't think anyone does." In the following weeks, the camp changed again. The fences remained, but the barbed wire no longer felt like a boundary. Soldiers and prisoners moved freely between spaces, working together to prepare for what came next. Some of the women were already planning their departure, trying to locate surviving relatives. Others lingered in uncertainty, afraid of what waited beyond the gate. For many, there was nothing to return to cities bombed to ash. Families scattered. Ingrid spent her nights writing letters she never sent, words meant for people who were likely gone. She wrote anyway because it made her feel less alone. When orders finally came to release the prisoners, it didn't feel like liberation. It felt like losing something they hadn't realized they'd built. The guards lined up by the entrance as the women gathered their few belongings. There were no speeches, no formalities, just quiet goodbyes carried on the wind. O'Connor stood beside Patterson, who was overseeing the process with a rare gentleness. "You did well here," Patterson said quietly. "Whatever happened in this camp, it mattered." O'Connor nodded, though his throat felt tight. "We just tried to keep them alive," he replied. Patterson looked at him. When Ingrid approached Klaus holding her hand, she stopped in front of O'Connor. She was dressed in the same tattered dress she had worn when she arrived, but her posture was different now, stronger, steadier. She looked up at him with tired eyes that still managed to hold gratitude. "I will not forget," she said softly. The boy smiled shyly, reaching out a small hand. O'Connor knelt and shook it. "Be good, kid," he said. Klaus nodded solemnly, though he didn't understand the words. Ingrid turned to leave, then hesitated. "Your coat," she said. "It saved us." "I wish I could return it." O'Connor shook his head. "It found its purpose. Let it rest." As she walked away, he felt something in his chest shift a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. The line of women stretched toward the open gate, their steps uncertain but determined. William stood beside him watching. "Feels strange," the younger man said. "Letting them go." O'Connor nodded. "Maybe that's what freedom feels like. Strange." Months later, after returning to Boston, O'Connor received a letter postmarked from Munich. Inside was a photograph. Ingrid and Klaus standing outside a small hospital, both smiling faintly at the camera. On the back, written in careful English, were 4 words, "We are alive. Thank you." He sat at his kitchen table for a long time, the photograph trembling slightly in his hands. The noise of the city outside faded, replaced by the memory of the wind, the snow, the sound of a child's laughter breaking through the storm. Williams wrote to him 2 years later from Iowa. He was married, had a farm and 2 children. Sometimes he wrote, "I still wake up thinking about that night, about the coats. My wife says I was crazy to give mine away. Maybe she's right. But if I had to do it again, I would. 1,000 times." Patterson went on to write his reports about the camp clinical official, full of numbers and observations, but somewhere in the margins he included a single line: "Acts of humanity, even small ones, can preserve order better than any law." It was a quiet rebellion in ink, a truth that would outlive him. Years passed. The camp itself was dismantled, its wooden walls, torn down the land, reclaimed by grass and silence. But the story of that winter lingered. Former prisoners and guards exchanged letters for decades. Some even visited one another when the world became easier to cross. The children who had been saved grew into adults who carried those memories like invisible scars and quiet blessings. Klaus became a doctor. Maria became a teacher. Ingrid, until her death, kept the wool coat folded at the foot of her bed, a relic of warmth born in the coldest season. O'Connor never returned to Germany, but he carried the small wooden cross with him everywhere. Sometimes when the wind howled outside his window in Boston, he would hold it in his palm and close his eyes. He could still hear their voices, the hum of women singing through the night, the laughter of a child who should have frozen, but didn't, the quiet, steady rhythm of hearts refusing to give in to hate. History would remember battles and generals' victories and losses, but not the night when soldiers broke the rules to save lives. Yet for those who were there, it became the truest kind of victory. A victory over indifference, over the instinct to look away. The kind of victory that no medal could honor, but that lived on in the generations born from mercy. In the end, it wasn't the cold that defined that winter. It was the warmth shared between enemies, the fragile thread of humanity that refused to snap even when the world demanded it. And somewhere beneath the snow that once covered the earth like a grave, that warmth still lingers, a quiet promise that even in the darkest hour, compassion can outlast the storm.